couple hours before that, he served them communion and he washed their feet. And you're going to hear Jesus is going to be on trial in front of political leaders and religious leaders. And I hope that as you're listening today, and Good Friday's hard, Good Friday's uncomfortable. We don't do the resurrection on Good Friday because there was 3 days. And so enjoy the tension and sit in it and live in it. And know that God is with you in the tension as well. And so I invite you to meditate on the scripture, meditate on the words we sing, listen as we sing together. But most importantly, if you hear anything else this evening, we want you to hear that God loves you very much.
On the first day of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Where do you want us to make the preparations for you to eat the Passover?" He said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is near. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.'" So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover meal. When it was evening, he took his place with the 12. And while they were eating, he said, "Truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." And they became greatly distressed and began to say to him one and another, "Surely not I, Lord," he answered. "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him. But woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born." Judas, who betrayed him, said, "Surely not I, Rabbi." He replied, "You have said so."
Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, and began to be grieved and agitated. Then he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and stay awake with me." And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "So could you not stay awake with me 1 hour? Stay awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again he went away for the 2nd time and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." Again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. So leaving them again, he went away and prayed for the 3rd time, saying the same words. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand."
I come to the garden alone, while the dew is still on the roses, and the voice I hear falling on my ear, this song of God discloses. And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own, and the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. He speaks, and the sound of his voice is so sweet, the birds hush their singing, and the melody that he gave to me within my heart is ringing. And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own, and the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. I'd stay in the garden with him, though the night around me be falling, and he bids me go through the voice of woe. His voice to me is calling, and he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own, and the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known.
While he was still speaking, Judas, one of 12, arrived.
With him was a large crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priest and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer has given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him." At once he came up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you are here to do." Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. Suddenly, one of those with Jesus put his hand on his sword, drew it, and struck the slave on the high priest, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will not once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But now then would the scriptures be fulfilled, which say it must happen in this way." At that hour Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out with the swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a bandit? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, but you did not arrest me. But all of this has taken place so that the scriptures and the prophets may be fulfilled." Then all the disciples deserted him and fled.
Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on his head. They put a reed in his right hand and knelt before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. After mocking him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on them. Then they led him away to crucify him.
From noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani?" That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "This man is calling for Elijah." At once, one of them ran and got a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink. But the others said, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." Then Jesus cried again and with a loud voice and breathed his last.
Kids asked me in the car today, why is it called Good Friday? Doesn't seem very good. None of us have laughed this entire service. This isn't the feel-good moment of Easter Sunday or any normal Sunday around here. Why is it called Good Friday? And so I started trying to explain why it might be called Good Friday, and they said, well, why did Jesus have to suffer and die? And then that led to a conversation of why do we have to suffer and die? And the words came out of my mouth that I've heard so many times, death is just a part of life. And it made me think all day long. If you were around in, let's say, 20th century Russia, and you were walking down the streets, you might see Stalin's secret police in the alleyway executing somebody. And it happened so often, so frequently, that you might have developed this apathy to where you walked by and you said, you know what, that's just part of life. Maybe the late 19th century France, or late 18th century France, actually, if you were walking down the street, there might be even this big public demonstration where someone was being beheaded by a guillotine, and it happened so often with such fanfare that you might have just walked down the street to the bakery thinking, it's just part of life. Could have been 19th century America that lynchings were such a big public event. They were this kind of community event that they would get around to execute a man or a woman, and they happened so often that you might have just been on your way to school. And you might have just seen one happening and said, well, it's just part of life. Or maybe you were in first century Jerusalem and you were on your way, maybe you were making a trek all the way to Rome, and as you walked along the Roman highways, you might see crosses all along the road at the latest uprising, the latest example that Rome wanted to make of those who would steal Rome's power, the latest criminal who needed to be put to rest and made an example of. You might have seen crosses all over the place, and you know what? You might have become so accustomed to it that you might have just walked by and thought, it's just part of life. Good Friday seems so abnormal to us, but for the people of Jesus' time, there's nothing abnormal about what's going on. Death is a part of life. Execution is a part of life. Suffering is a part of life. And yet, those people I know who are continuously suffering would never tell you that they feel normal. Those people with chronic pain, those people with depression, those people who have been bullied, those people with cancer, those people who have lost loved ones, those people who are under the threat of war at this very moment would never look out the window and tell you this is just part of life. They would long for the old existence where they could run around carefree. They would long for some future place where they could run around carefree. They would look at you and they would look at maybe able-bodied people, or they would look at those who are not under the threat of war. They would look at people who just wake up in the morning and hear the birds singing, and they would say, why can't I have that? What I have must be different, as common as it is. As common as suffering is, nobody I know who suffers would just say, it's just part of life. About 11 years ago, there was a gentleman named Ted who walked into the doors of Stonebridge United Methodist Church. And it was very audacious, very bold, actually. Ted walked into our offices, and without even saying hello or asking for an appointment or anything, he just said, "My name is Ted, and I have ALS." And we didn't really know how to respond to that, and we especially didn't know how to respond when he said, "I'm dying, and I need you to be my church while I do." What was really fascinating was watching our associate pastor, Dina Steiner, who would go visit Ted every single week, and he would play chess with Ted, and together they would lament, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And he joined this Bible study group full of guys who were very willing for questions to be asked and for community to be formed. And I remember at one point I was sitting in with this Bible study, and he was talking about it, and Ted himself said, "I just have to come to terms that this is part of life." And there was a man named Jim, and Jim we called Eeyore because he was the most, he was really hard to be around most of the time. But Jim was the one who said, "Ted, ALS isn't part of life. ALS is part of death. And one of the things that I want you to know is that death is not part of God's plan." This is one of the things that gets said over and over again when people are suffering is, well, this is part of God's plan. This is what God's will is, and some meaning will come out of this suffering. Don't worry about it. God has a plan for this. But what we see is that Jesus is on a cross, and he offers up a prayer. We've been looking at prayers over the week. Jesus offers up this prayer, and it's not a prayer like in the garden where he says, "Thy will be done," because the prayer before that, the prayer in the garden before "Thy will be done" was, "Lord, please take this cup from me." And "Lord, please take this cup from me" is, I don't want to do this. Hanging on a cross is not normal. Hanging on a cross is not something I'm supposed to do as a human being. And so, "God, please take this cup from me." But there are other motivations. And so, of course, Jesus says, "Thy will be done," and we'll get to that. But if hanging on a cross and suffering is entirely God's plan for us, Jesus would not have quoted the first line of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Because if Jesus is in a mindset of feeling forsaken, then this is not normal. It's not normal to suffer and die. It's not normal to hang in public execution. This is not something that should happen. Suffering and death should not happen in God's preferred world. He quotes this psalm, this prayer from Psalm 22 that if you read through the rest of it, it is this back and forth between my life is awful, but I'm just going to push through believing that there's something better. I'm going to have faith on some level that God is still with me. So what I believe we see on the cross is that despite all the people, when I think of these scriptures, I often think of this chaotic scene. And we often picture it as like all of Jerusalem came to watch this happen. I wonder how many people walked right by and said, it's just another one. But Jesus, who has the full mind of God, Jesus, who has the full experience of a human being, questions why this is happening. That this is not normal to suffer and die. But on the other hand, he also knows that those who do suffer and die ask the same question. Why do I have to do this? Where's God in all of this? Which is why that first prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane is followed by the second prayer. Thy will be done. That it is God's choice in Jesus Christ to suffer with us. To be on that cross and lament, where is God? To be on that cross and suffer and die. Because then we can know in full confidence that there is no experience that we can have as human beings that God hasn't experienced God's self. God has been born, God has lived, God has felt abandoned, God has felt loved, God has eaten with his friends, God has eaten alone, prayed alone. And ultimately, God has suffered suffered with us, so that in no part of our life, when we are suffering, do we ever have to say, this is just part of life. What Jesus does when he goes onto that cross and he enters into that part of our existence and that part of our experience is he offers the presence of God. And where the presence of God is, well, if God is with us, then who can be against us? And gives us the hope that sin does not win, that death does not win, that suffering will not last forever. Because it's not supposed to be a part of life. Not in God's life. Not in a world that is cleansed of sin. Not in a world that is cleansed of suffering. And that's the world we still long for. And we still hope for. But what I hope tonight is that you do picture Jesus suffering with you. Well, if God is with us, who can be against us?
At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs were also opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many. Now when the centurion and those with him who were keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and what took place, they were terrified, and they said, "Truly, this man was God's Son."
Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. Were you there when they laid him in the tomb?
It is finished. This was a part of his life so that we could have the hope for all of our life. Let us go in the uncomfortable silence that will be Holy Saturday. Go in peace.